Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Protocol Town Hall, a weekly guest talk series where we invite technologists, teachers, engineers, and now poets to talk about protocols and protocol studies. Today's guest is Robert Peake, who's an acclaimed poet and technologist who's kindly agreed to come on and share his thoughts about protocols, poetry, and infinite games. We're very excited to have him on the channel, and musicality and art have been ongoing threads of the program for the last few years, and we are finally getting some esteemed guests to come share their thoughts and formalize it into a more, thorough interpretation of protocols and what they mean in a more poetic sense, and what poetry can do for protocol designers who work in more hard tech engineering environments. So without further ado, I'll bring Robert onto the stage, and he can take over with his presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, Timber. And I've been excited to be thinking about this. When Venkat originally asked me if I would do a little something about poetry and protocols, it was right before I was about to head out for a retreat in Southwest Ireland. So I've had the benefit of spending about a week thinking about this stuff. And if it comes off as green and rain-soaked, that's because that's definitely was the precipitating environment, no pun intended. So I think I'd love to just kind of dive in. We will have plenty of time for questions, and this will be an interactive thing. You'll get a chance to write. You get a chance to hopefully experience, as well as be provoked in some thinking about poetry and about protocols. My hope is that it's useful both to poets and to people thinking about protocols. So in terms of the stakes, what's at stake here? Poem by Bertolt Brecht, To Those Born Later. Truly, I live in dark times. Frank speech is naive. A smooth forehead suggests insensitivity. The man who laughs has simply not yet heard the terrible news. What kind of times are these? When to talk about trees is almost a crime because it implies silence about so many horrors. It was written in 1939 and translated from the German, but feels kind of fresh to me as well. So I guess the point of opening with this is that poetry can't necessarily change the world, but it has changed my world. Therefore, I believe it can have, in some small or big way, depending on how you embrace it, an impact on yours. So first, some definitions of protocols, as I've been thinking about them and in conversation with people in the protocol kind of study group. My background is in criticism and also in craft. And I think the more interesting material that poetry can provide to protocol studies comes from the craft side. And to me, this kind of mirrors the different sort of hierarchies, but different levels of thinking about protocol as well. So obviously the ground sort of zero definition, protokolon, right, means literally first glued. So it's preface, right? It's the thing you stick onto the text, the meta text that says, here's how to read it. Up from there, the kind of standard definitions we think of, the sort of behavioral guidelines for repeatable outcomes, push down and twist. And then communication guidelines, right? So the P in HTTP or TCP, usually for interoperability, but also sometimes for debate, for argumentation. I think of these as kind of your first order protocols, what's sort of already in the OED maybe. And then as I got to talking with people, this idea of an engineered argument came forward, which I really like, but which I also see as a little bit more of a kind of second order type of protocol, in that it's active, it's ongoing, it's protocoling, right? It's more like, let's say, in the case of the internet, the dynamic tension between its origins in DARPA as a sort of distributed system that is highly robust because it's inherently sort of asynchronous and the packets can arrive in any order, the conflict created by our intense desire for streaming media like this, which requires sequentiality and low latency. So that conflict between net neutrality and packet prioritization played out in the whole kind of request for common RFC world is a kind of protocoling or a sort of ongoing protocol for the evolution of protocols. And I think poetry is fundamentally that. So my hope is that that is interesting, because that is where I think it has a contribution, or the most contribution perhaps, to make. And then this other idea that came forward in reading and in talking with people is this idea of tension, of creating and resolving tension, which is something we do in the arts all the time. And tension as a definition being a compromise with an added conflict. So those are some definitions, my working definitions. As you can tell, I'm going to be fairly opinionated on this, but with a purpose, right? Not to be didactic, but to maybe incite thinking about this, and hopefully leave enough space around the more sort of concrete assertions that I make about these ongoing practices. So we're going to be talking about poetry-ing, we're going to be talking about poem-ing, and we're going to be talking about poeting, and what these can contribute perhaps to the idea of protocols and protocoling. So I'd say notice what you notice, participate in the writing exercises, because experiential is invariably going to spark more thinking than just talk and listen stuff. And so let's get into some canonical definitions of poetry. There you go. I'll give you a minute to read these versus reading all of these out. So clearly poets have converged on one standard definition, which is great, of what poetry is. One of my definitions that I arrived at some time ago, actually as an undergraduate, when I first met the poet Seamus Heaney. He had come to our university to read from his new translation of Beowulf, and he read this kind of litany of all the accomplishments of their leader. That's the kind of preface, the protocol, and at the end they sort of very satisfyingly say that was a good king, And I got to thinking about the social function of poetry, and also realizing that Old English poetry was very often alliterative. So what's in common between alliterative, between meter, between rhyme scheme, is that it forces concision. And so my definition of poetry, or one of them, became poetry is one of our sort of oldest living compression algorithms, right? Now, song is slightly different, associating tones and pitches with, at least in atonal languages, is more like a memory room. It's more like creating associations, fusing, neurons that fire together, wire together. But this actually forces the brevity. It actually compresses the text. So then I got to thinking about the way in which this creates sequential memory and how this serves a cultural purpose. So Lynn Kelly's memory code and all that work around song lines, the ways in which not only does it encode an incredible understanding of the ecology through these short verses, but also who we are, how we relate to the land, who our ancestors were, etc. So in thinking about earliest peoples, I started also to think about Werner Herzog, and in one of his documentaries made this assertion that rather than Homo erectus, we might consider Homo spiritualis a more fitting title. And that's because this reaching for the transcendent through art is just an incredibly common through line, whether that manifests into the sort of religious world, or into worship of ancestors and a reassertion of who we are as a people, which carries on now into academia, right? The fundamental idea is that poetry, that art uses its materials to transcend its materials. So poetry uses words to transcend words. That's a quote by Marvin Bell. You're going to hear a lot from him because he's a poet who really embodied to me living in conversation with poetry, like Seamus Heaney, actually. But Marvin Bell, I got to work with up close as a mentor. So a lot of his ideas will be coming out, just that I've collected over time as a magpie. Um, and yeah, Heaney. This image is of a bog person believed to be a woman who was being punished for adultery. Her head was brutally shaved, and she was wearing a harness around her neck. And it figures in Heaney's poem "Punishment," the final line of which reminisces on, in the context of his modern experience of the Troubles in Northern Ireland in the 90s, what he called the exact and intimate tribal revenge. So this idea that poetry has a timeless quality of encoding kind of within it. All right, writing time. So you can do it on paper, you can do it on Word doc, you can do it however you like. But take just a second and jot down one thing that is false about poetry. More than one word, doesn't have to be a whole sentence, certainly can be a whole sentence if you want to. But yeah, jot down a line, as it were. And we'll be doing something, obviously, with this in just a minute. Cool. Okay, so we've defined poetry. Poetrying, as I said, is the art of using words to get beyond words. What does that mean? Poetry uses words, right? So the set of words, poetry being applied to it, is greater than the sum of those individual words, right? The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So it's a Gestalt system, and that's true, but not terribly interesting, maybe, because there's an awful lot of Gestalt systems out there. By the way, I just today was reading in Venkat's Protocol Studies newsletter about Fermi and Dyson, and realized I had already put together kind of all of these different equations, that these are sort of both inspired by Fermi and Dyson unwittingly, right? So not so much in the case of Fermi answering something as a broad sort of quantity, order of magnitude, like how many piano tuners are there in Chicago, but more giving the shape of an equation that can define what the protocol is. But at the same time, of course, it's a little bit outlandish and gratuitous to do so, right? It's a bit more sort of the Freeman Dyson over engineering, which is my favorite kind of engineering. So hopefully these equations, as you see them, will give both sort of mathematicians and poets a little bit of a chuckle. And in that chuckle, there's some slack and some space for you to do some thinking about how this is maybe directionally right, and also a bit much, perhaps. So I'm going to have fun with it anyway. Look forward to more equations coming your way. It's also, maybe more interestingly, a Gödeling completeness, right? Particularly his first incompleteness theorem, where any formal axiomatic system, any system built on sort of self-evident truths, there are truths that cannot be proven from within that system, right? So there's all kinds of lovely paradoxes and things that go on with that. But basically, the poetry of words is a superset of words, is an incomplete system in itself, reaching toward a kind of completeness, using words again to get beyond words, is, of course, is unwinnable as a game, is impossible as a game, and is also important. So a classic kind of infinite game, a game of tensions, right? So I think this idea of using words to get beyond words is what I would call the fundamental tension of poetry, that gives it its power, and as I think fueled its protocols and its protocoling over time. So poetrying, the act of doing it, the act of the ongoing relationship to poetry as a writer, as a reader, particularly in this case, as a writer. The great quote by Marvin Bell: learn the rules, break the rules, make up new rules, and break the new rules. So there's a lot of rules. Let's talk about what some of the rules are. There's rules in language that we don't even know about, right? Intuitive grammar, language-specific stuff, like the fact that this sentence can't really be tinkered with to be made more grammatically intuitive. Because if you swap out any adjacent pair of words, those two words and the two words around them don't feel as right to a native speaker of English as the original sentence with that particular order of modifiers. I was learning Welsh for a little while, and wow, there's something called the Welsh mutations that not only follow some rules of grammar, but also follow rules of phonetics and of mouth placement even. So you will change the words in a sense so you don't have to move your mouth in a different way to say the next words. So there's almost a kind of intuitive, poetic reality to that native Welsh speakers take for granted. And those of us from the outside find incredibly difficult to codify and therefore learn. So these rules in language are a kind of first order protocol. They get broken for effect within the context of a poem. What sparked all of this, the initial invitation to give this talk was Ben Kent and I having a conversation around the language-specific natures of form, and particular things like the ghazal or haiku, how taking that out of its native language into English loses so much of the power and intent. So it's using words to get beyond words, and it's using language in a way that's endemic to that language to get beyond. So in terms of form, form is just composed of elements, different devices that you can use, and they're also language specific. And the use of form and the evolution of form is, to me, more of a second order, more of protocoling. The forms themselves are kind of first order. They're prescribed. They're the rules. And if you look at something like the permissible variations of sonnets, for example, you'll quickly realize, oh my gosh, there's only certain tweaks you can make to iambic pentameter that really sound okay, much to the chagrin of neoformalists and others. So those are some of the rules that we're talking about, and they're received, they're innately understood. They're also formally received through education, and quite a few of them need to be unlearned for those of us who learned only the criticism side maybe in schooling up to sort of university level. When you start to approach craft, in fact, you almost have to flip the script entirely. So let's look at what I call the fundamental algorithm of craft. And I apologize, I should probably dip into the chat and check some of this out. Yeah, I can't ask a fish about the water. Yeah, exactly right. So I can't ask a Welsh language speaker to explain, all of the mutations, because they just are deployed almost by muscle memory. Great conversations going on. Apologize if I don't address all of them. But hopefully we'll get to a lot in the chat and the Q&A part. This fundamental algorithm is about learning the rules, breaking the learned rules, making up new rules, and breaking those. So as you can see, it's inherently recursive, right? It's kind of head recursion in this protocol or meta protocol. And anything that you can write recursively, you can write iteratively. So there it is for sort of in generations. And I think the breaking function is one of the most interesting parts of all of this. One of the parts that may be missing, for example, from self-governing systems, from government constitutions, perhaps, to protocols for decentralized communication, or running a company like Holacracy or others come to mind. But the protocoling, the ability to break and remake, is, I think, what gives it the ability to resolve some of these unresolvable or seemingly unresolvable tensions over time and through many, many iterations. And to address the impossible, trying to deal with the problem at the level of the problem, trying to use words to transcend words. All right, so just jot down underneath the previous thing that you wrote down that's false about poetry, jot down one thing that stood out to you so far about the talk, but I didn't say that, so it could be, something in the room you're sitting in. So once you've got that, what happens when you don't learn the rules is disaster, particularly the Tay Bridge disaster of 1879, where a railway bridge collapsed over the river in a storm, and the carriages went down and 90 people were killed. It was a terrible disaster, and almost equally terrible, is this poem by William McGonagall of the same name. The Tay Bridge disaster. Beautiful railway bridge of the silvery Tay. Alas, I am very sorry to say that 90 lives have been taken away on the last Sabbath day of 1879, which will be remembered for a very long time. I'll skip the middle and give you just the end. It must have been an awful sight to witness in the dusky moonlight, while the storm fiend did laugh and angry did bray along the railway bridge of the silvery Tay. Oh, ill-fated bridge of the silvery Tay! I must now conclude my lay by telling the world fearlessly and without the least dismay that your central girders would not have given way. At least many sensible men do say, had they been supported on each side with buttresses. At least many sensible men confesses, for the stronger we our houses do build, the less chance we have of being killed. This is this is not an elegy I would read at the funeral of my worst enemy. Right? It has all the trappings. It has all the trappings of the language of the era, but it is both tone deaf in terms of the lyric and in terms of addressing the material and the gravity of it. And of course, the incredible conclusion, build better houses. So what happens when you only learn the rules, but don't break them? I asked ChatGPT to write one of the greatest poems of all time. That was the only prompt into a blank new ChatGPT conversation. When the world forgets your name and time dissolves the edge of flame, when all the maps have lost their lines and clocks grow mute in dust and brine, walk still, walk slow, let silence speak. There's grace in every weathered peak. The stars do not recall their birth, but still they sing across the earth. Let no one's praise or scorn define the sacred hush of your design. A life well lived is not a shout, but presence steady, burning out. So when you fall, fall like the rain, unheralded but not in vain. Each drop returns, each root will swell. You mattered, and the soil can tell. ChatGPT said this was a great poem because it was clean and open to interpretation. It scored it as 85 to 88 on a scale of 1 to 100. It said it was ranked among the best poems by poets like Mary Oliver, Jane Hirschfeld, Denise Levertov, or late work from Rainer Maria Rilke, all of whom I really like. There's a project called the Poetry Assessor, where Michael Delvey and an Australian researcher trained a model way back in 2013 using Clark-Pavia word norms and these kinds of things on published poems and poems in sort of amateur poetry sharing forums online. And it gives a gradated score between -5, totally amateur, and +5, totally pro was his term. It scores this as a -0.6. Right, so more on the amateur side. I would say if a student brought this to me, it fundamentally suffers from lofty abstraction, right? That it's treating ideas in the space of ideas with some rhetorical flourishes and a bit of music, but that ultimately it betrays a lot of what we have to unteach, what people have to unlearn from their formal education about what poetry is or is not from the reading perspective when they seriously come to want to learn to write. We need to teach them how to break an awful lot of rules that went in and which obviously have made a lot of training fodder for large language models online. So, here we go. Ode to My Toaster. This is a response to the prompt, write one of the worst poems of all time. And this is actually something Marvin Bell would often say to us students when we had writer's block. Go write a terrible poem. Just go write a terrible poem. Yeah, first of all, the bar is low. That's great. But also, what he pointed out and what we learned from experience is it's really hard to do. There's always going to be something kind of interesting going on. You'll get a line or two or something that's unique, that's potentially worthy of expansion when you try really hard to write something bad, having been steeped in poetry for a certain amount of time. Ode to My Toaster. Roses are blue, violets are the sun. My toaster is crying because bread is fun. Crumbs of destiny fall like rain. In my shoe I feel the pain. Toast is love and butter is glue. I'm a dolphin in a sea of stew. The moon is made of paper clips. I kissed the sky. It licked my lips. Never forget, unless you remember, that pancakes grow in late September. O toaster, fiery chrome box of fate, you burned my soul and also my plate. ChatGPT said this was not a lofty enough topic. It had negligible cultural impact and was executed with poor lyric. It gave it a score of 35 to 45 on a scale of 0 to 100. And what's absolutely amazing about about these analyses is that they very precisely follow the plot of the Dead Poets Society. I don't know if you remember, but Robin Williams' character at the start of class had his students tear out the preface, the protocolon, to their anthology of poetry, literally physically rip it out and throw it away because he said it was utter nonsense. That preface put out a theory of poetry, which is that it can all be graphed on a 2-axis graph, one axis being the importance of the subject matter, the loftiness, the significance of the subject matter of the poem, and the other axis being how well it was executed as a poem. So you plot that point, you draw a rectangle, you calculate the area underneath it, and that is how good a poem it is. Robin Williams did something different. He had one of the students come up, and he took down that picture of Walt Whitman that you see behind him, and he had him close his eyes and he had him think about and describe and talk about Walt Whitman, and he just started kind of free associating until he came up with some interesting stuff under duress. One line that I remember is he described Whitman as a sweaty-toothed madman, right? A bit like a dolphin in a sea of stew, right? There's something there There's the start of something. There's an idea that's a little different, a little rule breaking. And this is what he tried to impart to his students. And of course, the whole thing is cinematic, is heightened for effect, is kind of a parody, and yet it's not. It's precisely the kind of thing that ChatGPT has learned from our collective contributions of what we have learned in the classroom environment that is so keen to make unnecessary and inappropriate, unbreakable protocols for us to try to understand poetry when poetry is inherently a lot more slippery than that. Okay, so to the writing. Now write down one thing that's interesting about poetry. This will be your third line on a page or a Word doc or what have you. Should have 3 lines now. They can be sentences or they can be fragments or whatever. In the 20th century, all of these different forms and the shift from modernism to postmodernism, because we weren't thinking ahead about how we named things, there was this kind of great flailing around as people became more and more pressed to reconcile poetry and the music of plain speech in light of rock and roll, one of the major innovations of the time, jazz before that. And as a result, we had this, learning the rules and breaking the rules, again, as this iterative set of generations starting to converge. So as these generations moved toward the very end of the 20th century, it began to sort of converge on what we call free verse. Turns out this was, in an evolutionary algorithm sense, more what you call local minima rather than a global minima, right? A kind of false nadir, a convergence point that wasn't a stable settling point. Because as we march on into the 21st century, free verse is only one, kind of one option. The prose poem, the new formalism has become much more sort of just embedded, not even as a school, but a more standard approach where we just have a very rich palette now of options, and some options that do, of course, still sound a bit antiquated. But the idea is that convergence is ultimately not the same thing as not having rules. Even free verse has so many embedded intuitive grammar, natural, sound sense rules to it that we would be hard pressed to articulate, as the Welsh would with mutations. But it's not the same thing as the opposite of rules. So this final little equation is my postulation. As these generations continue and continue and continue, they will never be, at least, a sort of asymptote that represents a lack of rules, the negation of all rules. Here's a little sample of the kind of stuff that went on in the Great Flailing. So here's a poem by Marianne Moore, who was much celebrated in the 20th century. The Fish. Wade through black jade. Of the crow-blue mussel shells, one keeps adjusting the ash heaps, opening and shutting itself like an injured fan. The barnacles which encrust the side of the wave cannot hide there, for the submerged shafts of the sun, split like spun glass, move themselves with spotlight swiftness into the crevices, in and out, illuminating the turquoise sea of bodies. The water drives a wedge of iron through the iron edge of the cliff, whereupon the stars, pink rice grains, ink-bespattered jellyfish, crabs like green lilies, and submarine toadstools slide each on the other. All external marks of abuse are present on this defiant edifice, all the physical features of accident, lack of cornice, dynamite grooves, burns, and hatchet strokes. These things stand out on it. The chasm side is dead. Repeated evidence has proved that it can live on what cannot revive its youth. The sea grows old in it. Okay, have you guessed the form? Take a guess into the chat. What is the form of this poem? A new form, a novel form, a set of, and also a fairly timeless one, to be honest, but a set of rules that hadn't been around for quite a while. Have you guessed? It's simple syllable counting that she imposed on herself. This is probably the most evident example, but some of her longer poems that would take a lot longer to read, more complicated, follow the same pattern as well. So let's give it a go. Count the syllables of each line of the previous 3 things you have written. Just count them and jot the number off in the margin. And now you're going to write 3 new things that you've noticed so far. Hopefully about the talk, but whatever. And for each of these things, write them using the same syllable count pattern. So that means line 1 and line 4 have the same number of syllables. Line 2 and line 5, line 3 and line 6 have the same syllable count. Take a minute, one and then the other and then the other. Okay, and if you're feeling brave, you can pop a line into the chat, one of the lines you like, either of the first 3 or the latter 3 set. Just pop a line into the chat that you like. It need not be remarkable, or maybe it is. Any takers? The chat's gone ghostly quiet. Oh dear. Well, hopefully you found it at least interesting. Vicat, yes. It'll take 10 minutes to do. Okay. All right. Well, when you do have your 3 more lines with 3 more syllables, you can rearrange them. You can scramble them around as you see fit. So it doesn't have to be the first 3 and the next 3. And then you give it a title. Once you've done that, you have written a poem. Congratulations. So hopefully some of you at least have written a poem at this point. So what are poems? Here's some definitions of poems before we get to what poeming is. Okay. Here's what poeming is. First of all, a poem listens to itself as it goes along. And secondly, it's a quarrel. So a poem listens to itself as it goes along, right? Every line is informed in some way by the previous line. I couldn't use L twice, so I used lambda for line, and that seems kind of appropriate because lambda is your anonymous function. So it can be a line, it can be a sentence in the case of prose poetry, or a word in the case of concrete poetry, but every unit is recursively in tune with the previous units. And it's anthropomorphic to say this, but it also gets at this quality of attention. And interestingly, it's very similar to how LLMs generate, right? Just replace token with line. And I think it's one of the kind of flashy sort of mechanical Turk aspects of LLMs that they stream the tokens onto the screen as though someone were back there behind the curtain typing really, really fast. But when writing, every line listens to the line before it. And here's the quarrel, a kind of dialectic marching of quarrels to which we add third selves and fourth selves and fifth selves after the resolution of the pairings of quarrels. So I'd argue that this is another way of thinking about tension, that in fact, the resolution of quarrels between two selves is a compromise always, to which you add another conflict. This is why Paul Valéry said, for example, a poem is never finished, it's only abandoned. Right? Because this is a head recursion, it would go on and on forever, right? So you capture one frame of that, one iteration of the calling of the quarrel, and you have this resolution of two selves and a third self coming in to make it more interesting. So let's do some writing. So think of it, choose an object in the room, think of someone you hate, and just say something in the voice of that. Give the object that voice and write a line. Just do this quickly, just whatever, just write a line. Don't take 10 minutes. Take 10 seconds. And then choose another object in the room. Think of someone you admire. Give the object the voice of that person you admire and have it write out a line. And you can go back and do these if we're moving too fast. But the third one would be just give it a response, right? A response to those previous two lines. Give the poem a title. Phlogitis like and binoculars I hate. Excellent. So congrats, that's 2 poems, right? So you've written 2 poems, so now you're a poet because there is no definition of a poet. But here are some attempts. So now let's finally get into talking about poeting. So these are the algorithms for poeting. Poeting being the protocol, not only for writing, but for living as a poet, being a poet every day. So Marvin Bell said, be a poet every day. When you're not writing, you're still noticing your inner environment, your outer environment, and what you have read. Reading is essential. It's the in-breath. And when you are writing, when you finally start to write something, the change in self takes in or produces that writing, which of course then gets factored in. And now you're dealing with this, again, recursive or iterative approach. And it produces work. I would say work is the sum of all of this, but it also produces a self, which I would say is that limit as you approach the final day of the result of your work of noticing the inner environment, the outer environment, what you've been writing and what you've been reading, and synthesizing all of that in this infinite game. So poet is someone for whom poetry, this has become a what we call a whitehead protocol. I call it your operating system, your way of being. It's also a foolish pursuit, poetry. Or Graves said there's no money in poetry, but hey, there's no poetry in money either. So it's even. But there are social implications to poetry, and I don't mean foolish in a pejorative way. The fool, I mean much more in the sense of, let's say, the jester. Right here is Kiyoami, in my favorite version of King Lear, which is Kurosawa's Ran. He is the fool who lives outside the protocols of the court and is therefore able to speak truth to power with impunity, and does so. And here he's narrating the terrible fate of the foolish king. So poetry is a foolish pursuit in that it's an unwinnable game, but it's also in that pursuit a game that allows us to play within a space of greater truth, independent of a lot of the protocols, social protocols, other protocols that are imposed. They're imposed on us. That's Marvin Bell, my mentor, and he passed away fairly recently. But I think one of his poems really nicely encapsulates this idea of living as a poet. So I just have a little more after this. I'll read this poem and just have a couple other thoughts after this. We're very near the end. This is Wednesday by Marvin Bell. Gray rainwater lay on the grass in the late afternoon. The carp lay on the bottom, resting, while dusk took shape in the form of the first stirrings of his hunger. And the trees, shorter and heavier, breathed heavily upward. Into this sodden, nourishing afternoon, I emerged partway toward a paycheck, halfway toward the weekend, carrying the last mail and holding above still puddles the books of noble ideas. Through the fervent branches, carried by momentary breezes of local origin, the palpable sublime flickered as motes on the broad leaves, while the higher good and the greater good contended as sap on the bark of the maples. And even I was enabled to witness the truly existential, where it loitered famously in the shadows as if waiting for the moon. All this I saw in the late afternoon in the company of no one. And of course, I went back to work the next morning. Like you, like anyone, like the rumored angels of high office, like the demon foreman, the bedeviled janitors, like you, I returned to my job. But now there was a match head in my thoughts. In its light, the morning increasingly flamed through the window, and lit by nothing but mind light, I saw that the horizon was an idea of the eye gilded from within, and the sun the fiery consolation of our night times coming far. Within this expectant air which had waited the night indoors, carried by, who knows, the rhythmic jarring of brain tissue, by footsteps, by colors visible to closed eyes, by music in my head, knowledge gathered that could not last the day, love and error were shaken as if by the eye of a storm. And it would not be until quitting that such a man might drop his arms that he'd held up all day since the dew. So that's the unwinnable and important game of poetry and of poeting. Before James Cause kind of coined and codified this infinite game idea, Herman Hesse wrote a book called The Glass Bead Game about this infinite game. And Magister Ludi said of the game, no permanence is ours. We are the flood that flows to fit whatever form it finds. And so in a way, I see this as a protocol and as a preface in a way for living. Rilke said the purpose of life is to be defeated by greater and greater things. He also said it is to live in the question. So if the purpose of poetry is poems and the purpose of poems is poets, I would say those are some of the protocols for writing and, more importantly, for living and for being. So that's what I got. And that's the view from the window in Ireland, by the way, that inspired some of this talk. So I realize I've gone on a little longer than expected, but I'm very eager to open this up to conversation, discussion, reflection.
That was an awesome talk and surprisingly technical. I think we've had engineers on before and scientists, and I don't think that they have gotten that technical in the conversation about their topics, despite you might think that they would. I think we will, of course, the chat can ask questions. If you have some, please put them in the chat and I'll bring them up on screen. I did want to kick us off with one, though, just selfishly. I was wondering, because my exposure to poetry growing up, I felt like a lot of the poets and the people that wrote poetry that I knew were fairly on the Luddite side. They really like the kind of like pasture forests and focusing on what once was, and not so much the technological, scientific stuff. And I was wondering if your career has influenced your poetry, the technology that you've been a part of in creating, how that's come to fruition.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, poetry, I think, to succeed, kind of always has to have a little dirt under its fingernails, right? The lofty abstractions, the concepts alone don't good poetry make. So, very much, I think my work has been influenced by having a technical mind, but it's not. It's again, it's not so much in the abstractions, which is so much of what we deal with in the kind of ideational content. It can be, but it needs to be tempered by music. It needs to be tempered by imagery. It needs to be grounded in the real and the experienced in some way in order for it to give us enough of a foothold as human beings that we can get into that experience. So it can't just happen from the neck up, I guess, is what I'm saying. At the same time, yeah, absolutely, right. Ecopoetics is a fascinating field that is very much addressing, rich bodies of science, but doing so in ways, again, that humanize the science, the research, the ideas, in the moment of observing, a wonderful biological specimen, for example. Does that make
Um,
sense? Yeah.
it made sense to me. Yeah, that was a
Yeah.
wonderful answer. Venkat has a question, and I'll actually bring him on stage to read this out.
Hey, thanks for inviting me to do this, Venkat.
Hey, good to see you again after I think like 15 years. I think we might have met at the GTD summit in, when was that, 2008 or
In
something?
San Francisco, yeah, long time ago.
Really long time ago. But yeah, the one thing I got curious about was often when I try to like take in a poem, I actually do have to read it aloud to like figure out the right way to like I don't know, internalize the cadence and rhythms and tempo, and that helps actually unpack the meaning of what I'm hearing. And clearly, in your talk as well, you read out several poems, and I think the orality of poetry is different from that of music and song, right? So, could you
Yeah.
comment on like the spoken aspect of poetry?
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely a kinesthetic art, right? There's a reason we read it. We read it aloud, in poetry readings. And when reading aloud is incredibly important. I'm also engaging much more the auditory part of my brain when I'm writing than the part that will scan for content in a piece of technical prose. So it's absolutely true. And it's very, I think, intimately tied to memory. Because memory is not just a function of the gray matter, it's a function of the whole body. And recitation, I think, comes out of the muscle, comes out of, kind of the whole self. Breath is kind of the fundamental unit of rhythm in poetry, right? And so it has to be breathed out, it has to be spoken. And that's one of the great constants that ties it all the way back to a prehistory tradition, an oral tradition, as a sort of mnemonic sequencing device, because it uses the full kind of physical consciousness, if you like, not just the sort of RAM that's up in the gray cells. And so, yeah, it's absolutely intimately tied to language and intimately tied to the vocalization of language as an art. Yeah.
And it strikes me that the spoken aspect also helps fulfill the function you pointed out of like words transcending words, because
Yeah.
if words are just text on the page, in a way, like it makes no difference whether I'm reading a handwritten poem or in like Arial font or Calibri, or those things don't matter. The
Comic
type
Sans, I draw the line at, but yeah.
I mean, some of the like indentation and like line breaks matter, but beyond that, there's a lot of like slop allowed. But in spoken performance, every little aspect matters. This is like, orality might be the dirt under the fingernails, as you put it. And it actually struck me in the Marvin Bell poem you read out at the end that there was almost a whiplash quality of moving from like, terms like existentialism and like liminal broad leaves and stuff. And on the other hand, like going straight to like match head in my brain. And it struck me that he was using that poem to kind of introspect kind of viscerally about the process of abstract thinking itself.
Yes.
Does that kind of make sense? It's like a way to
I think that's a really astute
Yeah.
reading. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And knowing Marvin and knowing his greater body of work, he absolutely is sort of playing with elevated diction and the way in which that addresses elevated ideas, and then undercutting that, right? And constantly seeking after the musicality of plain speech, the casual remark, who knows, who knows where this came from, this profound existential moment, right? And to me, that's one of the great things about the range of poetry, and particularly his work, that it can encompass the sublime, the absurd, the quotidian, and kind of sweep it all up into, again, this more Gestalt kind of experience that is greater than just any one of those modes or tones. So, I mean, he was an incredibly sort of whimsical guy too, sort of deeply wise and also profoundly unpretentious, with it. And I think that voice comes through, and I think that's a great way of putting it.
And on an orthogonal note to that, like I'm thinking of like stylization and mannerism in poetry as an abstraction with extra steps almost. And one of the differences you see between modern poetry, which feels very, very much in touch with like lived material reality, as opposed to say like medieval poetry in any language, there's like very stylized tropes almost that keep recurring, the same motifs that become almost shibboleths within the community of poets, right? Like we were talking about Urdu poetry on the Discord earlier, and that is a genre I've consumed a fair amount of, and it's full of like exactly the same recurring motives of like the drinking hall, the cup of wine, and the beautiful woman walking in who you always talk about in like without reference to specifics. Maybe this is because it's an Islamic art form and you don't want to get too particular. So, it's like after a while you get bored of mannered and stylized poetry because it stays in this realm. Has there been some sort of like evolution there, or like a discontinuity in the evolution of poetry away from mannerism and stylization?
Yeah, well, I think I love the idea, of just saying, hey, that's just prose with extra steps, right? Because I think that's a really nice summation of where, for example, William McGonagall makes some very prosaic statements with a few apostrophes and elisions and O's here and there and a dash once in a while, right? So decorating prose or decorating familiar motifs is not poetry per se, to me. It's a broad church, but it doesn't strike at the heart of what really makes it poetry most effective. And partly, I think that's because you're looking at an outside-in approach, right? Almost a kind of re-editing of either what's gone before you as tried and true motifs that you can use for signaling, or an idea that you had that you want to convey, and now you sort of poetize. Poetry doesn't work that way. It listens to itself as it goes and evolves from that. And one of the biggest ways to evoke poetry is through constraint. So these writing exercises, for example, impose all kinds of constraint that force you to attend and force you to think. And these kind of things show up too in things like improvisational acting, where so many of the rules are just to kind of get you out of your head and get you present, frankly, by imposing so much that it almost seems kind of impossible to play the game. And then suddenly you're in a game that transcends those rules as well. So there are other art forms too that do this, but it's always an inside out process rather than the other way around. And yeah, there's kind of a virtue, sort of a virtue signaling perhaps, but that's usually not what makes for really interesting work. Subverting the virtue signaling makes for interesting work. But again, it has to come through organically rather than as some kind of imposed or conceptual thing. Poetry knows when you've got an idea in mind. It knows when you got to look at it. You got to look out of your peripheral vision at it. You look directly, and it just it evaporates.
Lots more thoughts, but yeah, I'll hand it over to Timber to wrap up since we're at the hour, and hope to continue the conversation elsewhere.
Yeah, definitely. I can make the handouts available too, of these slides if people want that, and I'll pop a few links into the chat, and maybe we can also put these into. Oh, it doesn't like me doing URLs. Maybe we can put these into the description, Timber, some links to the handouts and to some further reading if people want.
Certainly, yeah. And I think we'll also include links to the handouts and the readings in our Friday or Saturday newsletter that's going out, so that people can participate in this asynchronously, and maybe we can send them to the Discord so they can do the exercises, which were quite fun. Kind of this meta protocol for getting people to write poetry. Yeah, thank you, Robert, for joining. I'll go ahead and take you off and do the closing spiel. Really appreciate it. This was a wonderful talk, and it's definitely in our top 10 that we're going to recommend to people on the homepage. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Bye. Thank you, everybody, for joining the Protocol Town Hall. It's a weekly guest talk series. The next talk is with Charity Majors, talking about observability as part of our formal protocol theory track. You can actually now apply to the Protocol Symposium, which has a formal protocol theory workshop in Vancouver, BC from September 12th to 14th. We hope you apply soon. There's limited spots, and we also have a protocol school from September 15th to 19th, which is online. You can also apply to that now at summerofprotocols.com. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon.